how I get to the problem for today, and then how, what the suggestions are for responding to this problem, and where I am and why I need help. So I got involved in what's now called tobacco control back in probably around 1982. By 83, I was a president of something called the Group Against Smoking Pollution in Massachusetts, and I was teaching a class in the law school called Consumer Protection Planning, because I had a PhD in planning, which I wasn't using for anything, since I know nothing about urban planning, for example, which is what it was supposed to be applied to. So I figured, you know, okay, let's figure out how do you plan to protect consumers? Meaning, as opposed to the typical law school course, which is organized around a particular set of tools or doctrinal issues or something like that. This was, okay, here's a problem, and how do you tackle the problem? What kinds of competencies, what kinds of people, what kinds of tools are available and useful for tackling the problem. So I'd become, and every year I would say, you're running a consumer protection agency, now we call it NGO, or a public agency. What do you do? What are you trying to accomplish? And what do you have available to get there? And how much good will each of these different instruments do? So, you know, these were the law students, and I just become head of this little anti-smoking NGO. So I said, what do we do? And being law students, they came out based on what they knew about. They said, sue the bastard. So as a result, I set up the, along with a former natives raider, who was a Boston psychiatrist who was been chatting with me about these issues, something called the Tobacco Products Liability Project. And that was in 1984. We had our first conference in January of 1985, and I expected that, and then the idea was to hold tobacco companies legally accountable for the death, disease, and addiction their products cause, and we really focus on addiction. It was 3 years till the Surgeon General first, came around to conclude that this was indeed addictive. So I had, I set up this project, and I assumed, since I hadn't, we were talking about it, I hadn't taught civil procedure, I hadn't taught any of the relevant courses, and had no particular expertise in any of this, and I assumed that somebody at another university, presumably, who actually did have the expertise, would take this thing and run with it. Nobody was doing it yet, so I figured I'd get it started. Well, it turns out they actually all knew too much. They knew you couldn't sue tobacco companies. So it was quite impossible. It had been tried in the 1950s and 60s. It didn't work then. There were warning labels on the sides of the packages. It was simply not possible to do. So, this was a fool's errand, and I had it all to myself to set this thing up. So, so I went with it, and this had, it achieved some success, and a bunch of things I can say about it, but they're really sort of off the point. So the fast forward, we still have, this has been, relative success. There's been lots of cases, particularly the state attorneys general. They didn't all sue, but they all got involved in the settlement with the tobacco industry. Most of them sued in 1998, I guess it was, and something called the Master Settlement Agreement. And the tobacco industry paid lots of money to the states, continues to pay lots of money to the states, and they agreed to not do a bunch of things that's really made a considerable difference. They agreed not to, basically, to do very little advertising, and particularly not kids-oriented advertising, but basically, as a result, they've done very little advertising, and they funded some counter-advertising campaigns. So it actually, and there were, as a result of tobacco litigation, including that, there were a humongous number of incriminating documents that were released. We're talking about over 10 million documents that are sitting on a website, easily accessible, called, I think at this point, the Truth website. That's what used to be called the Legacy website, which was one of the things set up as a result of the Master Settlement Agreement. They originally called the American Legacy Foundation, and then changed their name to something like the Truth Foundation, and the website that they're funding changed its name accordingly. So, and this has been very useful in basically making the tobacco industry politically radioactive. Until this time, the people were perfectly happy, even if you weren't in a tobacco growing area, to admit that you got money from tobacco companies, perfectly legitimate American businesses, and afterwards no longer acceptable. You know, not that it can't go through various front groups and so forth, but it becomes much more difficult for the tobacco industry to buy themselves Congress. And there was actually some important and promising legislation that, as a result, was adopted in 2009 and signed by Barack Obama that gave the Food and Drug Administration pretty broad regulatory authority over cigarettes, which they have done absolutely nothing with. Really, totally shocking. You know, it is just amazing what they haven't done, given their ability to do things that would make a difference. So, for example, the legislation even talked about the first thing they should look at is menthol cigarettes, particularly focused on the African American community, and you know, humongous amount of support. There was a study, original study that was done by a advisory group that was set up there, came out and said menthol, while it doesn't make the cigarette for cigarette any more deadly than a non-menthol cigarette, it does make it more addictive. Easier to take up because menthol basically is a mild anesthetic, so it moderates the initial difficulty of uptake, and somewhat more difficult to quit. And nothing happened with it, and then the FDA, to buy some time, had an internal staff study that basically replicated the same result, and that all happened 4 years ago, and they've done nothing, and they've done nothing on all kinds of other things that they could have done something about. So, okay, so the problem is, why? Who cares? Problem solved, right? Nobody smokes anymore. Well, the estimate is still on target. We still have worldwide 6 million people dying each year from tobacco-related diseases. Probably going up. The estimate for the 21st century, which I don't think has been revised downward, is 1 billion premature deaths worldwide. In the United States, we have 485,000 deaths. We have, 3,200 kids, youth under 18, starting to smoke every day, or trying it every day. 2,100 kids and young adults, transitioning from experimenters to daily smokers. An estimate that 5.6 million Americans today who are under the age of 18 will die of smoking-related diseases. That's 1 out of 13, of all people in the United States under 18 will die of smoking-related diseases. Now, maybe things are, getting better, but what's the state of the art? So we have regulation, which so far has been a, at least the typical kind of federal regulation that goes to a regulatory agency with a, broad set of standards and so forth, which so far has been a complete bust. With some unfavorable court rulings that they can point to as an excuse for not doing anything, but a pretty weak excuse for not doing anything, not even trying anything. Okay, what else? What's effective? Taxation is probably the single most effective thing if you were left in one of the, I'm talking about state-of-the-art devices. What are the state-of-the-art things? And then I'm going to get to edgy things. And I'm on the edgy side with another impossible idea. So the state-of-the-art stuff, and this thing is called the crazy idea to save millions of lives. Well, there's where your millions of lives are. Then already the 5.6 million, the billion worldwide. So we're there, and the question is, what does the non-crazy stuff do? Taxation, a 10% tax increase produces, I think it produces a 14% drop in uptake and a 4% drop in overall smoking rate, so that's pretty good.
Dick, so what, a pack of cigarettes costs $10 now?
Something like that.
How much of that is tax?
Most.
At least half, right?
What do I know? I mean, it depends on the state, first of all.
Yeah.
Where are we in Massachusetts, where I think federally it's a couple of bucks, and I think Massachusetts may be a couple of bucks. So it's, the rest is profit, as Warren Buffett, was quoted as saying in, what was it, something of the Barbarians, this thing about, the book about the R.J. Reynolds merger. Warren Buffett was thinking of buying tobacco companies. He says it's a great business because, cigarettes cost pennies to make and they sell for dollars. So the cost of manufacture ain't much, and so it's profits at various points along the way. And that's, those are the branded names, and then the, unbranded cigarettes go for somewhat less. Yeah?
Where do the e-cigarettes come into play? Because they're unregulated, like completely unregulated, right?
Well, these cigarettes are the one area where the FDA has announced that it has proposed regulations. So what the effect of e-cigarettes is on those numbers is totally controversial, unknown, and unknowable today. I mean, we'll know it 20 years from now. We'll look back and say, whatever, about e-cigarettes. That doesn't stop people from, and particularly in the tobacco control world, but in the rest of the world as well, from having very strong opinions, right? So, there's a split in tobacco control between people who think it's entirely a bad thing, that that it's simply another route for people to get hooked on nicotine, and then they'll switch to the real thing after they do the e-cigarettes for a while, and then people who say, no, these are kids who would have smoked, and instead are using e-cigarettes, which are much, much less harmful, though presumably equally addictive. So, who knows? Some of each, whatever. They probably are useful, though, again, there's conflicting data on it. But anecdotally, I basically believe it, that they are useful for some people who desperately want to quit and have tried absolutely everything else. I've heard enough anecdotal stories to think, there has to be some reality there.
But aren't there other anecdotal stories that the rate of usage among teens is higher?
Oh, the rate of usage, more than anecdotal, rate of usage among teenagers
and growing
is considered, something like 24% have tried an e-cigarette in the last year of the older teens versus something like 10%. You now have a 10% smoking rate, cigarette smoking rate among teens, which is an incredible drop. So, but the question is this good and or bad? So some of the drop in cigarette smoking as a result of the e-cigarette use, which is what the rah-rah proponents say? Or is it a totally unnecessary, additional, hey, I got another way to hook people and make lots of money? Yeah.
And we also do, I mean, there's so much unknown on this, and we also don't know what's going to happen now that the FDA is banning sales to youth. So is that good or is that bad? Is that going to, right? I mean,
is it going to work?
Is it going to work? Is it going to make it an equal playing field? So now more youth are doing e-cigarettes because they can buy it legally. Well, now might as well do, tradition. I mean, there's just the long-term population-wide impact. It's just not clear.
And then also, what's in an e-cigarette is different than a regular cigarette, right?
Well, what we know about e-cigarette, what we know is that the smoke that you get from the e-cigarettes is much less toxic. There's a dispute as to whether it is toxic. Good reason to believe, and the answer is, at this point, it's the Wild West. So there is no such standardized thing as the e-cigarette. I mean, a regular cigarette basically is the same thing, with lots of different dress and different filters in the front. But it's, whereas an e-cigarette, who the hell knows, but nonetheless, even if they are somewhat toxic, they're much less toxic than regular cigarettes. But the question is, why even compare them? You compare them only on a theory that you're doing one instead of the other. And if we're talking about a 60-year-old, I'm willing to buy that. That there probably aren't a lot of 60-year-olds who don't smoke cigarettes who are going to say, boy, this is a really cool idea. But
but Dick, are they, so are e-cigarettes produced by the tobacco companies, or do they compete
not.
With the, so they're
they started off, as Donald Trump would tell you, with the Chinese. It was a Chinese invention, imported into the United States. At this point, the major tobacco companies each have a major brand that they're pushing because, whether they think they're going to make money on it, they certainly want to tell their investors that whatever happens with the market, they are prepared to get on top of it. Yeah, they do.
It was answered in that other discussion.
It sounds like craft beers versus like mass-produced beers, right? Like eventually every mass-produced beer made a craft beer to compete with, this other market that was rising.
Right. Yeah. Right. So we really, the answer is we really don't know. No very good reason. There's no very good reason to think that e-cigarettes will have a major positive impact on smoking uptake and smoking addiction. Right? Is that fair? You studied this.
Yeah, I think that's right at a population level, although we really don't know. I think there's some good evidence that for particular, so there's the individual versus population. First, there will be some people for whom e-cigarettes will serve as a useful form of smoking cessation. There will also be other people, and this I think is true with the 60-year-old, right, who e-cigarettes will serve as a way of deterring them from smoking because they can't smoke at work, but they can use an e-cigarette at work. So so how that all nets out, not clear. The only other thing I would
you may or may not be able to use an e-cigarette at work. Right?
Well, it also depends on the workplace. It depends on your jurisdiction.
Right
now, in a lot of jurisdictions, you can't. So that's not clear. The other just thing is there is at least some discussion in the literature about how the enhanced regulation of e-cigarettes, which just came down a few months ago from the FDA, will increase the market share to the large companies, right, the tobacco companies, because they have much greater capacity to play the regulatory game, right? So there's a lot of, the regulatory process is a barrier to entry, it's complicated, you need lawyers, and blah, blah, blah. So that may affect
that seems very likely. On the other hand, the public health impact is quite unclear because who cares who's poisoning you, right?
No, I'm just saying responding to the question about the
But is there a way, or would it be beneficial to incentivize the big companies to grow their e-cigarette market and cannibalize their regular cigarette market?
Assuming it was going to cannibalize the e-cigarette market. That is the assumption.
But can we make it do that?
Well, thank you. Let's move on. Let's move on. So I think there's a fantasy. Maybe one can argue there's more than a fantasy among the great proponents that somehow it will cannibalize the cigarette market. Not clear why one would think that, except possibly for at least some people who are trying to quit. And as Wendy points out, maybe even in that age population, the balance between using it in a place that will let you use an e-cigarette, and that's of course a great question and debate as to whether e-cigarettes should be banned, so the arguments get replicated there in places where smoking is banned. But anyway, let me just finish going through the state of the art. Tax increases, smoke-free environments, we're just talking about that. Smoke-free environments, the purpose was never to reduce overall smoking rates, but of course it had that effect in two ways. One, because three ways actually. One, you just smoked fewer cigarettes in the course of the day if there were long periods when you're awake when you couldn't smoke. Secondly, you were more likely to quit because most smokers want to quit. Most smokers want to quit at some point or another, if they're in withdrawal every day for 3 or 4 hours before they can get a break, then they have an opportunity to just continue the withdrawal. And thirdly, the signaling, the social norm indication that this is. I knew we had passed an inflection point when I live on Clarendon Street and often walk by the Hancock Building, and when I saw people, men in suits, clearly executive types, with their secretaries, both outside the building in 10-degree weather, not coolly, smoking as in dosing. They were dosing. They were getting their nicotine level back up before the elevator ride back upstairs together. At that point, I realized something had changed in the social meaning. Warnings on the packages, the little warnings on the side of the packages probably did nothing other than provide, after the fact, an argument for the tobacco industry to claim that they were already regulated and therefore shouldn't be subject to various kinds of liabilities. But in the modern format pioneered elsewhere, because of course very little, the U.S. again is a backwater in everything besides secondhand smoke regulation. Partly because of our wonderful First Amendment as interpreted by the U.S. Supreme Court, which is, it is essentially a protection for large corporations to sort of say and do whatever they want and not be regulated in what they're saying except under strong showings and so forth. But the new international standard is plain packaging. So this is we were getting. It's really pushing the envelope in terms of state-of-the-art type things. The new state-of-the-art is plain packaging on olive green background, figured out based on a focus group tests. What do you ask the focus group? You give them a bunch of different color packages.
What's the most unappealing?
Yeah, which one we really have nothing to do with, right? Poop colored sort of wins that one. So that's the background, and then the plain packaging. There's 80%, in the state of the art. There's 80% of the package's warning is largely pictorial warnings, and then the name of Marlboro or Winston or whatever it is in the same block lettering. So that's the tobacco companies hate that. That's always a back in the early gasp days in the 1980s when we were trying to figure out what's effective and what's not. It was called the scream test. If you came up with a proposal, do some education in schools, no screams from the industry. So it's not going to make any difference. But you do something in the industry, screaming, okay, First Amendment, Bill of... Okay.
It works.
Yeah, okay. They're smarter than we are. They know that's a problem. Counter-advertising, the truth campaign, can be quite effective. the pictorial warnings on the packages are a form of counter-advertising, which is why learned Judge Leon of the District of Columbia District Court said, of course, they were totally improper and violated the First Amendment because they didn't appeal to the reason, they appealed to the emotion. And we all know that consumers are homo economica, right? or whatever, that that therefore the only thing that the government is entitled to do is to appeal to their reasoning and not to their emotions, which of course is, exactly what Madison Avenue does, right?
Exactly what's happened to presidential campaigns.
Right, exactly.
Whatever that emotion might be.
Substantive, right. Yes, I mean, it's really all substance all the time, exactly. So it's and then there's raising the age from age 18 to age 21. Now, when I got started, the age really didn't matter because nobody paid the slightest attention to it. But there have been, efforts, and sincere efforts, and reasonably effective efforts to actually, get retailers to pay attention and require some kind of ID, phony ID, but at least, make some kinds of efforts on the subject. And there was actually legislation, in the good old days. Do you remember a day when there was a group called the United States Congress that actually passed legislation in the public interest? And it would often typically be bipartisan. Well, something called the Sinar Amendment to, like Sinar, Oklahoma. Can you imagine a senator from Oklahoma actually wanting to do a public health measure, or actually believing in public health? We're talking about long history. I don't know, some of you may be old enough to remember, but these days, but the rest of you just have to read it in books. So we had the Sinar Amendment, which actually penalized states on federal revenue sharing if they didn't actively enforce the sales age. So that was done, and then raising it to 21. Massachusetts took the lead in this. Actually, Needham, Massachusetts was the pioneer, and a study done a couple of years ago in Needham, Massachusetts did it because some doc on their public health commission thought it was a good idea and did it. And, it turned out that Needham had a considerably lower smoking rate among young people than Newton. Or Wellesley. So, okay, so it actually looks like it made a difference.
So when was that done? Do you know, in Needham?
When Needham did it, probably something 2004, something like that. May have been even earlier. Easy to find out. One can do all the way we do complex research these days.
Right.
Right.
It's so interesting because it's not quite clear.
Needham and
Siri,
Needham
what
and
year did
yes.
But it's interesting because, it's not like Needham is a rural area away from all these other towns.
Exactly.
But, as a parent, it gives you a lot more clout, right, to tell your kids not to smoke when it's illegal to smoke, right? Like, I will really come down on you if I find cigarettes because it's illegal.
Right.
Like, it almost...
2005 and 2008.
Wow.
It's not illegal
It's
not illegal for them to smoke, it's illegal to sell.
Right. In fact, different states have.
The 18-year-old is perfectly legal.
Yes.
It's legal for them to go across the border.
Well, legal for a 15-year-old.
And smoke.
In most places, it's legal for a 15-year-old to smoke, unless it's not legal for anybody to sell it to them. But if they have it, they're not violating the law by. So again, and by the way, when we were beginning to try to figure out how to enforce this, including lawsuits, again, we had a successful lawsuit against Store 24 back in around 2004, thereabouts. Maybe earlier than that. Maybe earlier than that. It was called KYTE, I think it was 1994, versus Store 24. And, that holding, we had a settlement with Store 24 that they would actively enforce their smoking, the restrictions on sales. At that point, the tobacco industry came out and said their position was that it should be illegal for kids to smoke. should be illegal for kids to buy cigarettes. Well, again, you had the screen test. Why were they doing that? Lawyers in the room?
In lieu of making it illegal to sell.
No, making it illegal for both.
Is that because they're gonna get you anyway? Like, they're just gonna.
No, they wanted to stop the Kite case. Kite was a 14-year-old kid who smoked by his mother, his best friend, and so forth. And you want to come in and say, well, he's violating the law. You can't have people who violate the law bringing lawsuits.
Yeah, but that's awfully long-range thinking, right? It's a
No.
long time.
No, that was they were responding to the Kite case.
Oh, the consumer, because you were,
Yeah,
they minors as consumers.
Minors as consumers, and they wanted to knock them out as plaintiffs.
Because it wasn't gonna, for tort litigation, it's.
Yeah, no, but they wanted, it wasn't not for,
That's what I'm saying, long range. Yeah.
That would be long range,
The 14-year-old is.
that would be long range. Okay, so the result of all of these things, some more effective than others, but, and tobacco litigation, which was, my strategy, specific strategy, and worked with people pushing the other strategies as well, and doing it, but our particular shtick here, the Tobacco Products Liability Project, was pushing this one, and that one, resulted in I think the states would not have sued, but for our, having, kept the litigation possibilities alive at a time when the tobacco industry was busy burying them. The U.S. Supreme Court did its thing to eliminate the second wave of tobacco litigation in the 1980s by finding some of the legal theories were preempted because of those warnings or because of the legislation that put those warnings in. And the industry said, end of tobacco litigation. And we were coming out saying, no, 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 it's not. So keeping the flame alive was a lot of what we were doing. So, the litigation and litigation got these documents, which have been very useful. There have probably been 1,000 peer-reviewed papers, certainly hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed papers based on the documents. And so they've certainly been very useful in, things like we now have internationally the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and which has, I think at this point, 170 plus countries who are parties, and there's one country that's not a party. I'm trying to remember the name.
U.S.
The U.S.
I was going to say, but it was too obvious.
Right.
Because we don't sign treaties.
Yeah, right. We're in there with Indonesia and Somalia, I think. The South Sudan, somewhere. It's a select group.
Yeah, we're good at that.
It's a select group of non-parties to this. But I think, again, the fact that the tobacco industry really had been delegitimized as a result of these documents and the news around the documents, I think made it a lot easier for this, this to pass. Okay, so where do we get into the crazy ideas? So these are all non-crazy ideas at this point. Some of them were very crazy ideas at one point. For example, Stan Glantz, who's one of the great leaders in this in the field, and I were talking about what a crazy idea it was to suggest banning smoking in bars. That was never going to happen. So so it's not that only other people think ideas are crazy. The idea that you could have a tax initiative in California to raise the tax on tobacco after California had just passed an initiative lowering property taxes. Stan thought that was the stupidest idea in the world, and I couldn't disagree with him. Passed. So a lot of these ideas are impossible ideas that everybody, every knowledgeable person at the time, was in agreement that that's almost silly. Okay, we have all of them now. They're all there. When they're all working together, I don't think anybody thinks it's going to get the smoking rate much below 10%. Smoking uptake rate among kids much below 10%, which produces the estimate of the 5.6 million lives lost. Well, maybe that has to be re-estimated somewhat downward, but we're talking about millions of lives just in the United States. We're still talking about most of the billion lives, in this century around the world, still on target for premature death. So what can be done? Is there anything that can be done? This became known as, I was an early adopter, at least, of the phrase endgame. I don't know if I came up with it, but it was known anyhow as the endgame strategies, which is how do you finish it off? Is there a way to just finish this off? Now maybe it'll never absolutely, be gone, and there'll be people who are sort of edgy or whatever doing this really weird thing called smoking cigarettes. They did this back in the 20th century. Here are some, movies that whatever. Okay, but how do you basically get this thing down to, a 5% level or below and keep it down there? What are the strategies?
Sorry, I have a student appointment. I'll try to come back.
Okay.
You're ready with your punchline.
With the punchline, okay. Well, you can take a copy of the punchline. Let me circulate the punchline.
Okay.
So, and then we can talk about the punchline. The tobacco-free generation.
You're also doing
And the idea of the tobacco-free, well, let me keep one just to figure out what the heck I was telling people. So the idea of the tobacco-free generation is that anyone born after a certain year, and 2000 is a nice round year, because if you're checking people's IDs, you don't have to look very hard. Because remember, with age 18 or age 21, if you see what it says on the other side, for the cashiers, at the retail stores, it says anybody born, who's younger than, born after September 21st, whatever it is, should not be sold cigarettes. And you got to change that every day, right? It'd be certainly very easy to say anybody whose, ID begins with 2. But it doesn't have to be. If you miss that deadline, you can move up, again, without having to have these variable things. And the idea is none of them, at least for a couple of years, and in Massachusetts, I think Hawaii is all age 21. I think Massachusetts is likely to go age 21 for all of Massachusetts next year. New York City went to age 21. Fascinating, there was this huge controversy where the soda industry won about Mayor Bloomberg being a super nanny for banning the sale of greater than 16-ounce beverages, and then he moves the age of sale from 18 to 21. Nobody even knew what happened. The retailers got a notice from now on. It got nothing. So that was a okay. So if you have age 21, that would mean until the year 2021 that none of the people who would turn 21 in the year 2021 would ever have legally been sold cigarettes. So you're not involved in cold turkeying people, which are the other plans involved, trying to get people to quit, right? We all know how difficult that is. So there are other plans, other endgame strategies. There's nicotine phase-out. I had an op-ed in the Times, and I was promoting that at the national level. And at that point, I actually thought the FDA might consider doing it. I had some reason to believe, based on somebody there, that they wanted to do it, or that somebody there wanted to do it who supposedly was in a position to make it happen. I think if it turned out to have been in a position to make it happen, it would have happened, so obviously it wasn't. And then at the state level, the tobacco-free generation proposal. But the nicotine phase-out has and the idea of the nicotine phase-out is you would have, lower and lower nicotine levels, in each cigarette, which can be done through filtration, changing the filtration in each cigarette for another 5 or 10 years, and then you come out with, you know, there is a level of nicotine in cigarettes, and the actual only way to really make it happen is to reduce the nicotine in the cigarette rod itself. The filtration actually is easy to bypass.
Why can't you just take the filter off?
You can take the filter off. But you can actually reduce the nicotine, and there have been patents for it. Philip Morris actually made such a cigarette. It didn't go anywhere, called Next, N-E-X-T. And you can actually reduce the nicotine in the rod, so in the actual tobacco. So it's, there's no way to extract it because it ain't in there anymore. And so that's one thing to do, but it doesn't involve cold turkeying people, but it's still weaning them off. So it's a proposal. There were proposals to basically, you know, ban cigarettes, but of course that involves cold turkeying them. There are various ideas of phasing out the supply, but I think the economic impact of that is simply to raise the, you know, price. You might as well, rather than phasing out the supply, you might as well just keep raising the price dramatically. Yeah.
But the nicotine phase out, that could be the tool where you shift usage towards the e-cigarettes. If you don't phase it out in the e-cigarettes, but you do phase it out in the regular ones, if you've at least shifted people's consumption to something you think is safer or...
Right, well, it certainly is.
Yeah.
Almost certainly is. Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I still think it's a good proposal, but...
I think that's so clever. I mean, it sounds like how we regulate, you know, gas emissions and other types of things, right?
Right. Yeah, no, we were, I mean, I forget who was, this was a proposal that was, came out in the late 1990s when Congress was considering legislation to regulate cigarettes, when it was first considering it, and there was a reduction in nicotine in cigarettes was an idea that was at least kicking around. And the FDA actually has the authority to do that.
So the question is why? Why do we not do that?
Why do we not do it? And the question is, why is the FDA not doing anything besides, you know, going after e-cigarettes, which is, you know, probably worth doing, but hardly the big fat target that's really killing huge numbers of people. And why the Obama administration, that's supposed to be lefty and progressive and all that stuff, is doing zilch.
Is he a non-smoker now?
Oh,
that is that of course is a very open question. Only he and
They may have just decided, you know, in the Republican Congress, not a fight they want to bother with right now.
Well, I think they probably decided there wasn't a fight they wanted to be involved in, but they had the authority. They had the authority to do it.
Plenty of authority, just never use it. I mean, you know, that's the point. I think given, you know, your attention around, you know, Congress is always talking about riders, you know, budget riders, appropriations riders to rein in regulatory authority. I think they just don't want to pick a fight.
Well, it's also that they have the authority, but everything that they do try to do, including even the cigarette stuff, gets so tied up in litigation.
Of course, every gets sued.
With the forum shopping, it gets messy.
No, as LBJ once said, he said, you know, back in Texas, you know, we say you might as well be hung for a goat as for a sheep.
That's right.
Right? So, you know, if you're going to be hung up in court, it should be over something that maybe if you got by would actually make a humongous difference. So there, you know, so there's that proposal, and the TFG proposal is a modest proposal. It is a, you know, you can think of it as simply raising the age of sale by 1 year every year.
And those people can't vote.
Well,
they can't vote. Well,
you start with 2016.
But by that point, they're
They
old
start
enough to vote.
2016.
You start from this year.
no, never. That's right. They would never be.
They would never.
They would never.
It's cohort-based discrimination.
And by the way, their parents can vote. And if you ask a parent, at least in the United States, if you ask almost any parent, including parents who smoke, if you say around this age, 18, age 21, you say, at what age would you like your kid to start smoking? Is it 18 or is it 21? What is the answer going to be?
Never.
The answer is going to be never.
Right. They don't want the kids.
And the answer is going to be never, and that's even from, I think, from most smokers who, after all, are trying to quit and certainly don't want the same thing for their kids. So this has potential large political support. It would do the trick. It would phase this thing out. It's perfectly compatible with any other bright idea you might have, like nicotine phase out or raising taxes or anything else. And we can't get anybody to try it. We can't get Needham to try it. How do you get, and they actually have most likely have the authority. Very clearly, as the handout makes clear, very clearly the 2009 legislation quite specifically does not preempt this. Yeah.
So, and I apologize, I'm going to go in a minute, 5 minutes, because I do have a student coming. Just, I guess, you know, one point of fact that you brought, I just heard earlier today that Tasmania has decided not to put it up for a vote.
How did you, the boy came to the one, well, what's that, right?
But
Yes.
yeah, so.
And why is Tasmania so important?
Because it was going.
It was the one place in the world that was thinking of doing this.
But
The one place in the world, yes.
Tasmania strikes me as somewhat.
Of course, Wendy wrote a
legal
opinion for the subject. Yeah.
Tasmania strikes, not knowing anything about Tasmania, but knowing a lot about Needham. You know, I guess the theory works in Tasmania if it works, not putting the politics aside, and maybe the interesting question is why the politics not work. As long as you actually have a tobacco-free generation, so the theory is that you have a cohort that hopefully overwhelmingly is not subject, never gets addicted. Now, obviously, we know there's going to be some like adults that are smoking cigarettes, so you're never going to completely get it.
Right.
But it strikes me that that very concept is really hard to get at when you're dealing with local regulation.
I don't think
So
it would
for
work
kids, what?
It wouldn't work at all.
No, that's what he's,
But
but he
the-
said Needham, why does Needham do it?
Well,
the
but
problem
the-
is,
but
the
the
problem is
21
people
worked at
move to Needham who grew up right in Wellesley. You know, people move, so as adults, not kids. And so I think
This only goes to
really
sales.
hard. Yeah, no, I get it only goes to sales. But I think the idea of the cohort base, because you're not asking people to get cold turkey, and you start losing your voters once you start getting adults who now feel like they have to go out of their way because their local store, because they got addicted legally.
What do you think the fraction of smokers in Needham adults is?
Well, in Needham is very low.
We're talking about under 20%.
But I'm
right?
just saying, I think of all of the initiatives that we've seen, this one strikes me as the least amenable to local control.
Yeah.
That
No, it has
its
to be
very
stable,
concept
yeah.
of working might not work. You know, its brilliance requires a cohort that is unaddicted. And as long as it has that local aspect.
But they can buy their cigarettes. and do-
Whereas Tasmania, you don't drive to Wellesley from Tasmania.
I would have said that. I would have said that if you had not just talked about Needham banning sales and reducing the smoking rate.
Yes, right.
Like I would have thought people had just gone elsewhere, bought their cigarettes, and you wouldn't really have seen any reduction in the smoking rate. And I think, I mean, to some extent, maybe it's because they led a wave and it spread across Massachusetts. You know, maybe I don't know how much later Massachusetts.
Well, other places picked up later,
But
not immediately.
you could almost think about people choosing to locate in Needham, even if you are a smoker, to stop smoking.
Right. Smokers want not to smoke, yes. Let me just say one.
Oh, sorry.
Let me just say one other thing since Wendy's leaving. As far as I can tell, the overwhelming reason, the practical reason why Tasmania isn't doing it is because they know there has to be a good reason why this can't work. Because nobody's done it.
Right. Being early
It is impossible because nobody has done it, and if it were possible, somebody else would do it. So Wendy can be as eloquent as she can, you know, and so forth and so on. There has to be a catch here somewhere. So the question is, how do you get the first to do it? And let me just say one thing we did, as I indicate here, is we had a conference on endgame, strategies, and we suggested, we offered that any jurisdiction in the United States that attempts this and is sued by the tobacco companies, we will pay we will provide their legal support. Because one of the things the tobacco companies do is they say, we will break your budget by suing you. Yeah.
The question I have is that this idea of prohibiting the sale of cigarettes or tobacco products for people who are born after a certain date seems to presuppose that if you think that the next generation should be tobacco free,
yes,
you also think that they should be without the choice. They should not have the ability to choose whether or not to be tobacco free, right? So in much the same way, I don't want cocaine to proliferate in society,
right.
But I see the coherence of an argument for legalizing people's access to drugs that we now consider offenses worthy of years and years in prison.
Right.
So my concern here is that you're prohibiting people from choosing.
There's no question, if you legalized cocaine and you legalized heroin, though nicotine may be somewhat more addictive than either of those, but there would certainly be a strong argument against this. That's not the world we live in. We don't live in a, and by the way, you probably also want people to be able to choose to buy, would you like to be able to buy an inexpensive car that doesn't have all of these goddamned, you know, requirements set up by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration? Yeah, I mean, little brakes rather than big brakes or whatever, because after all, you'll drive carefully and you won't get into trouble, because that restricts people's choice. And certainly, this is the end of requirements of prescriptions, right?
But I'm not a cocaine user not because it's illegal. I'm not a cocaine user because I know that it's devastating.
Right.
And I'm similarly not a smoker, not because it's legal or illegal, but because I know that it's devastating.
But you impose costs on society when you're a smoker. So, you know, that everybody else bears, right? Like, we're all paying higher insurance rates for lung cancer and things like that.
See, the choice logic is actually a false narrative, because given a choice, the rational actor would say, I would choose not to smoke because I know it's bad for me. That, in fact, for the most part, what the choice narrative, you know, often suggests, I mean, it's a classic American default standard. What about choice? Well, the fact is that we know a lot of times that in areas of addiction and obesity, we know that too, because addiction to sugar, that we know that given a choice not to do this, people almost invariably will choose not to if they could.
Right.
So the point about a ban, a generational ban, is that in fact it removes from this generation the choice that they probably would choose not to do anyway. That's sort of the argument.
Okay.
And the fact is the overwhelming majority, the great majority of adult smokers, at least in the United States, make a choice. They make a choice every year.
Yeah.
Their choice is to quit.
I apologize if this is a stupid comment. I just, it is what came to my mind.
No, it's the point. It's an exact point.
Okay.
It's that false narrative about that we have in this country about choice.
Right.
Because they make a choice to quit every year, typically several times a year, and they simply fail to carry through because they're unable to.
And imagine you ask the average heroin addict.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
What if you made it like tobacco medicine, that you had to get a doctor's permission to use?
Ah, that is another, the prescription thing is another thing. Guess the lawyer's all gone from the room, but you know, the question is, if you're a plaintiff's malpractice lawyer, would you have fun with a doctor who wrote a prescription for cigarettes?
In a second.
Right. If you're a doctor, you're really going to cut a prescription for...
Well, that's the point. No one's going to do it.
But the doctor would have to have a medical reason, right?
Right, and of course, it probably is
back in the 1930s?
And there would be no medical reason for a prescription for a cigarette. There obviously is a medical reason for, you know, nicotine replacement therapy.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm thinking you were talking about the people who are addicted now.
Yes.
I mean, you could say that there could be a medical reason for that.
Well, the docs are already writing prescriptions. They're writing prescriptions for
pills, right?
Yeah, for, you know, I mean, there are various medicine. There are various prescription medicines, and then there's, you know, the things that used to require prescriptions are now over the counter.
Yeah.
These various nicotine replacement things. So that would be the doctor's response. There would be no doctor in his or her right mind would write a prescription for
Yeah,
a
yeah.
pack of cigarettes, even if they were allowed to do it, because, you know, it's the dirty delivery device. In other words, if what your patient is addicted to is nicotine, you don't want to prescribe the nicotine with a toxic, you know,
Sure.
delivery device, right?
Just do the patch.
But I have a question about the costs. Like you said that they impose smokers impose social costs, but have there been studies that say not really, that the costs, insurance costs are no higher for smokers than non-smokers?
There was a
Well,
one.
no, I mean, they don't pay anymore in terms
Right.
of insurance, but the overall costs of
Well,
healthcare.
that's what I've heard, that some of the studies are saying that it costs might even be less for smokers because they die younger. End of life, you know, and all the costs are the end of life.
Yeah, but those costs tend to be pretty high.
The tobacco industry tried this one in the Czech Republic.
And
This was about 25 years ago. They came in and they said, actually, smoking helps the balance, because there was an economic argument
it
for
helps
raising the
Social
tax.
Security.
And they were arguing against raising the tax because they said, actually, this saves money for the Czech Republic because people die very nicely just as they would otherwise be entitled to their state-provided.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. When the state started suing, a number of judges, I think there was one, I forget where, I mean, this was 20 years ago, the tobacco companies went in with this defense because the states were suing on the basis that this was costing them money. So this was in a sense, at least a legally relevant defense. And I remember a judge in at least one case, and I think this was probably basically followed, said that argument is not going to be allowed in my court. Yeah, I'm saying it's simply not going to be allowed.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. You can take it up on appeal, but it's not going to be allowed that you're a benefactor of the state by killing the people when they're reaching their golden retirement age, right? So, but going back to the economic argument, I think the issue is sort of when and at what point. It is certainly true that smokers, while they are alive, are producing a lot more cost to the healthcare
Thanks
system.
to lost productivity, you're out of sick.
Well, there's a huge lost productivity, right? But if lost productivity, if you're just looking for government spend, if you look at lost productivity, which is something like 150 billion a year or something like that. I mean, it's a very, it's big bucks in there.
But I think I do remember the study that you're talking
Yeah,
about.
the end-of-life health costs aren't really any more for smokers versus non, right?
Well, for
They tend
lung
to die
cancer, might be, right, if you're doing extreme measures, as opposed to if you just died of old age, right, at the end of your life, right? If you have an extreme end of life in terms of a long battle with cancer, right? Like that could be more expensive. But then, I mean, on net, like if you are adding up everything like reduced Social Security and those types of things, because you probably are dying in your mid-60s, right, as a smoker, isn't that typically the time where?
They can go pretty late now. You can die,
Well,
in your 80s.
Well, see, then you're costing us. I
There you go.
When you mentioned social costs, I thought that my interpretation was that you were saying that, in effect, if, for example, before we had a ban on smoking in bars, I didn't want to be in a smoky bar because I didn't feel good. It was a cost imposed on me that I had to incur, but not being a smoker, right? Is that part of what you meant, or so like a social cost?
I feel like we solved that problem with. I mean, we don't really have smoking in public places, right?
No, but I mean, if I'm.
But at the time, yes. I think that would be a very high cost.
But generally speaking,
that still is a cost that gets
secondhand smoke, right?
Inside people's homes, right? I
Yeah,
know
yeah.
plenty of, wives or whatever tell husbands to go smoke outside or whatever, away from the kids. But I mean, I think there are still some of those. But I meant more like the overall healthcare costs.
Okay.
Alan was pointing out though that there is this trade-off, like,
I think it was the British Medical Society or something did this big study in the 50s about smoking and how it increased lung cancer. And one of the defenders of the tobacco industry was R.E. Fisher, the statistician, who
Yeah.
who had a study and claimed that smoking didn't cause lung cancer, or that there's no proof that it did. Could be the genetics.
Well, that's
caused
my
both.
question, one of my earlier questions that we should ask.
Oh, yeah, by the way, the hour is long since over,
Yeah.
so that you're all obviously,
Oh, no, it's great, thanks, Dave. Appreciate
yeah,
it.
sure, but anybody who wants to hang around, I'm happy to
Well,
chat.
and you and I both talked about this before, that, that trying to apply this narrative to the sugar industry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I remember you saying famously a couple years ago, yeah, it's not gonna work right now.
Well, that's where my question was going, was,
Right.
is the reason why we
But
can't
anyway, if anybody has
apply
any ideas how to make this thing work, let me know.
I will, thanks, appreciate it.
is the
Great.
reason why we can't apply this to, like, say, the alcohol industry?
Right.
Because the medical evidence isn't as clear in terms of harm, or?
I was
why
thinking the
can't you
same thing,
sue-
yeah.
Why can't you sue Coors the way you can sue, RJ Reynolds?
Right.
Well, I mean, the question is, what are you suing RJ Reynolds on? You're suing them on, in most places, you're suing them on having lied about the product, having, encouraged children to take it up. You're suing on the fact that it's highly addictive, and you're suing always on behalf of somebody who was an addicted smoker. Whereas with alcohol, maybe 50% of the 40 to 50% of the sales are to addicted users, but only 10% of the users are addicted.
Yeah, the addiction is the big thing here.
Yeah, so it's the addiction is the addiction and the lies and about about what they knew. I mean, we're beginning, of course, to see it with others. We see it around the sugar industry. We're seeing it with of course, we're seeing it with Exxon Mobil. We're seeing,
What about the gun industry? Like, that's another one that it seems like we can't sue for harm.
Well, the gun industry we can't sue for harm for the reason that Congress, at the behest of the NRA, has passed a whole series of statutes making it, impossible. It almost is it's almost a felony to bring a lawsuit against the gun manufacturer. They would have, if the NRA thought they needed any more protection, I'm sure Congress would make it a felony to sue.
Yeah. And it'd be hard to see senators.
But the fact is we had a.
Well, I don't want to see alcohol banned, but it just makes
No,
me
well, we
wonder,
had-
like, why?
Yeah, correct. No,
Right.
we actually had one of our conferences. We had something like 25 conferences on the Tobacco Products Liability Project, and one of them we included guns, and a lot of thinking about how to go about it. And there's still some hope. There's a lawsuit, arising out of the Connecticut
Yeah.
thing, where they're trying to thread the needle around the statutory prohibition. They are unlikely to succeed, but yeah, I mean, litigation is an important public health tool, product liability litigation, and one should use it where appropriate.
Yeah.
And of course, the industries are very aware, and they're certainly very aware of the litigation against the tobacco industry, and they work very hard to try to, get whatever state. And so, for example, when obesity issues came up and obesity litigation began to be talked about, and there were articles in the early 2000s on whether big food is the next big tobacco. That was the headline in, I think, Forbes. They came around state by state with what are called common sense consumer consumption acts or something, known informally as cheeseburger bills, to make it illegal to sue companies or retailers because of obesity. And they got that passed in half of the states of the Union. So they're very aware of this. They're very aware of the public health implications and the bottom line implications. Bottom line implications. And they're very good at buying legislatures. So
Well, thank you very much for this.
Sure.
Yes, this is
Excellent.
Well, it's a pleasure, and again, any bright ideas,
Well, it seems
including
that-
anybody who is viewing this on the video, if you have any bright ideas, please email me at r.daynard@northeastern.edu. That's our new address, is right. And with your bright idea, take anything. Yep.
Well, it seems the best way, chance for this to work is at a state level.
Yes.
Because,
I think that's right. It could work at a local level.
I don't think it, well, I think I need them. Like, I
Needham
couldn't
could do
see
it.
the selectmen doing it because of the complaints they get from businesses that, you know, a decade from now, we're gonna be non-competitive with my.
Well, that's one of the nice things about it. It's so gradual.
It is gradual.
And they go in, and the convenience stores can switch to something else. I mean, they're only going to lose 2 or 3%
Yeah.
of their cigarette sales a year.
Well, who was it that, I mean, some drugstores have stopped selling cigarettes.
Entirely. Well, CVS, made the most noise about it when they did it.
Yeah.
And, they have big signs in front of the CVS's now, that we've stopped, we're gonna help you stop.
But if some states, do this, you think for a lot of households starting out, that's just another plus to live in that state.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's right.
Well, I think at one point, like during the late 80s, early 90s, wasn't it kind of common, like in school, to sign like a no drugs pledge, right? Like among your peers in high school. I wonder if you can, start it more of a grassroots thing.
Well, sure, there was something called the tobacco-free generation, the smoke-free generation, which was just that in Massachusetts, was funded by the money we got from the settlement of the state cases. And, it was a bunch of kids sort of doing, let's get together and resist, the blandishments of the tobacco industry. That's, good for what it is, but it obviously doesn't bind anybody.
Right.
And, the history with smoking in kids had been that 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds, even 10, 15 years ago, or particularly 10, 15 years ago, would, and earlier, say, yuck, smoking, yuck. And then they became teenagers and cool.
Yeah.
So
you're an ex-smoker or not?
5 cigarettes, I don't think that makes me an ex-smoker. No, I never
smoked.
I smoked. Yeah,
Did you
I
ever
smoked.
smoke?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I haven't for decades and decades.
Yeah.
Yeah, the addiction is though, really.
Yeah. Right.
All right. Thank you very much.
Sure. Pleasure.